Hi. So in this video I'm going to be talking about Anne Washburn's Mr. Burns, a post-electric play. This is so, like a lot of people, I really like post-apocalyptic dystopian type literature and drama, and Mr. Burns is definitely that, but it's got a really interesting take on this sort of post-apocalyptic problem. So we've got some sort of not terribly well-defined catastrophe in the beginning of the first act. It's a three-act structure, by the way, and that's significant for the movement of the play. Got some sort of not terribly well-defined catastrophe. There seems to be nuclear meltdowns. There seems to be disease spreading. There seems to be shortages of food, large numbers of people unaccounted for, and so on and so on. The key thing does seem to be that the electrical grid has completely just evaporated. And so we open with this group who are sitting around a campfire shortly after this catastrophe has taken place, and they are recounting a Simpsons episode, or attempting to recount a Simpsons episode from memory. This sort of campfire story type scene, and through their discussions and through the conversations they have with other characters who arrive, we find out something about what's happened to civilization. But we have here a very sort of basic repurposing of popular culture in the form of the Simpsons episode, repurposed to a different type of art. That, again, the sort of campfire narrative. And it's communally created as different people remember different lines, and they sort of argue back and forth about what order things happen in. They argue back and forth about whether or not particular scenes belong in that episode or a different episode, and so on and so on. So we have this sort of very basic form of art that is sort of collaborative storytelling. And I say basic form of art not to be dismissive of it, but in terms of like the technological development, the artistic style, and things like this, it's all very sort of loose and free-flowing and organic. As we get into Act 2, we have a more developed post-apocalyptic, post-electricity society, and we have a more developed form of art, again, built out of recollections of The Simpsons. So the second act, the characters are rehearsing. They've become a theater troupe of sorts, and they put on these sort of variety show, vaudeville type TV performances. Like, they're attempting to do scenes, if not entire episodes of The Simpsons, but they're also doing commercials for products no longer available. They're doing like MTV or VH1 style music countdown programs. So they're doing these different types of performances as part of this developing theater style. But it's still a very sort of basic, improvised type of theater where the props are largely homemade. Like, they've got a smashed out frame of a TV that they've put some candles in to sort of create a flickering glow on Homer's face as though he's watching TV. And they, for instance, have to put some foil behind the candles because the glow is not flickering enough to be visible from the house. So they're doing these sort of interesting but very basic sort of low budget production type things. And then when you get to the third act, this is 75 years after the second scene, or the second act. So the second act takes place about 7 years after the first act, and then 75 years in the future. In the third act, we don't have any sort of frame for it, but we have this really well-developed kind of high art production of this Simpsons episode, the Cape Fear episode. But it's clearly not the Simpsons. Like, it has evolved into this high art form where it's part of the thing, one of the most obvious things that happens is that the boundary between the Simpsons Cape Fear episode and the actual film version of Cape Fear, especially the version with Robert De Niro, that boundary breaks down completely. So we have the Simpsons treated as though it's a sort of psychological thriller slash murder mystery. But we've also got elements of Greek tragedy. We've got elements of the medieval mystery plays. We've got elements of high tragedy. We've got all of these different scenic elements, stylistic elements, have blended into one rather bizarre but really interesting play production of a Simpsons episode. So, like when Washburn is describing the scene here, for instance, she says that there's a proscenium arch weathered and aged with Simpsons characters carved into the side of it. So you can imagine this sort of like, you think of something like a sort of quintessentially Regency theater or something like this, with all the fancy decorations and the sort of Baroque depictions of nymphs and gods and goddesses and great actors and whatever it is. We've got that here replaced by The Simpsons. We've got that here replaced by Bart and Lisa, Homer, Chief Wiggum, Apu, etc., etc. So we've got a complete shift in the sort of tone and the meaning of what The Simpsons are from our own time, where we have very distinct sort of associations with them, to this sort of basis for high art. And so one of the things that I find really, really interesting is, again, that blending of different styles here. So this production in the third act starts with what's called a chorus of the shades of Springfield. So we've got that sort of Greek tragedy style approach where the chorus, led by Edna Crabapple, comes in, and they tell the story. And this is actually the other really interesting thing, is the production also becomes a Genesis story, a sort of Genesis myth for this post-electric civilization, because they come in and they tell the story of the nuclear meltdowns. They tell the story of the decline of electricity, etc., etc. All of which happened in the real world, in their real history. It doesn't take place actually in The Simpsons at all, but The Simpsons becomes this vehicle for exploring their own history And then we sort of go through, and again, we have these sort of weird bits where like lists of names get incorporated, and we saw that in the first act where people were trying to find their lost relatives, friends, loved ones, whatever it was. There's this portion in this version. It's on page 201, where you have this collection of plays, where we just have a list of random names that are among the sort of scraps of text that have been collected by this post-apocalyptic civilization and put into this bizarre hodgepodge of a production. So the reason this is all really, really interesting is because it's about the process of making theater, which I've only read 4 plays by Anne Washburn, but it seems to be something that she's really, really interested in. There's a big meta-theatrical component of at least these plays, especially Mr. Burns and 10 out of 12, which I'll talk about in another video. But it's a really fascinating idea to think about, like, how art forms evolve and how that natural human impulse to perform, to create, to be artistic, to be expressive, to be imitative, if we're going to think in terms of Aristotle, how that sort of natural impulse grows and changes over time, taking fragments, taking bits and pieces of culture, almost sort of T.S. Eliot-like. His famous line in The Wasteland is something along the lines of, these fragments I've shored against my ruin. We've got the same kind of thing going on here, this sort of post-apocalyptic reimagining of bits and pieces from The Simpsons, from Cape Fear, from Greek tragedy, from medieval morality plays, from high tragedy, from proscenium theater, from history and myth, all blended into one unique but recognizable form. So that play with what theater is a really fascinating element.